So welcome. I am Kat. I use she, her pronouns. I am currently on Piscataway land known as Washington, D.C. My organizer superpowers are logistics and operations. I just love getting into those nitty gritty details, and I am staunchly a stubborn climate optimist. I believe in people power and that together we can change the systems that we as a society are collectively building. So thank you to those who are here. Feel free to drop your intros in the chat, names, pronouns, where you're calling in from, why you're here. It's so good to see everybody, like what brings people to this workshop and where everyone's calling in from. A few words of housekeeping. Please stay muted when someone else is talking. We do want this to be a collaborative space. But we always want to be respectful of one another. If you do have questions or comments, please do write them in the chat and I'll get to them. If I don't get to them immediately, they'll probably be answered later in the workshop. And we also have plenty of time to work together and stuff today. So we will get to everyone's questions. And in general, as always, just please stay respectful in the chat. If you need closed captions, you can enable or disable those by clicking the button at the bottom of your screen that says closed captions. So as I just said, I'm currently on Piscataway, Nakotchtank, land. If you haven't done so, I do encourage you to go to native-land.ca and look up your own location. Indigenous peoples comprise less than 5% of the world population, yet they protect 80% of the Earth's biodiversity. Indigenous peoples have been the stewards of this land for a long time. And it's important to understand that colonialism isn't something that happened a long time ago. It's an ongoing process. So take this as an encouragement to start or continue your own journey of learning and shifting your mindset, thinking back to that first workshop that we had, right, to learn about the oppressive forces that we are a part of, whether we want to be or not, and question the systems we're in so that we can collectively build better ones. And this directly influences your actions. So as you get more into activism, your strike should not only incorporate this element in their target and messaging, but in the people you listen to, the ones you include in your planning, your form of the ones that you form coalitions with, etc. It's a balancing act to uplift Indigenous leadership while not putting the responsibility of planning and educating on their shoulders as well. And that balance can only be met if we are aware and educated. So for today, we are going to do a little action recap, think back to the previous workshops. Then we're going to dive into some roles, take a detour through logistics and coordination and talk about communication and planning tools. And then we're going to land back at safety and talk about marshals and permits. And we're going to wrap it all up and see what we can do with all this. So safety goes hand in hand with logistics. I'm going to be using them pretty interchangeably in this workshop where we talk about smaller actions. In larger actions, they'll need to be separated out more, but the structure that we're setting up today lays the groundwork for splitting into specialized groups, should your actions then grow to the size where that's required. Much of safety and logistics is thinking through your action in minute detail. So you're going to need at least a general vision of your action, the more specific, the better, to think through what you need in terms of logistics and safety. So if you've been to the past workshops and been filling out your worksheet as we go, please pull that up if you haven't yet. If you're joining us new, the link to the worksheet is in the chat or in the YouTube description, depending on where you're watching this. Feel free to make a copy and use that to plan your action. If you don't have a specific action that you're planning for yet, you can use the next global climate strike as an example. It's on March 25th with the hashtag People Not Profit. And there's also a link in the chat or description to the page with the narrative. So we're going to do a quick recap. For your action, there are 6 rough steps. These are an iterative process, so they don't happen like one after another, but these are like broadly the 6 steps that you're going to run through. So you're going to pick the type of action that you want to do. So get creative with what you can do to get attention and get that message across, or that target across that you're wanting to. Then you're going to pick a strike story. You're going to set your narrative and your demands, make your strike visual. So you're going to create signs, banners, graphics. Think about like the general, like what do you want your action to look like? What message should it convey visually? Then you're going to build people power. You're going to reach out to your community, spread the word, get people to join you either as organizers or as participants. Then you're going to activate the press. Let the media know what you're doing and why, and in general, just like the whole world doesn't have to be traditional media. And then you're going to navigate safety, which is what we're going to talk about today, where you're going to think through the details of your action. And here are the types of actions that we went through in our first workshop. Remember that in this workshop series, we are just looking at the strike as an action form and its deviations. There are many more types, but if you don't know or can't decide, then just go with the strike. I personally consider it to be like the basic nonviolent direct action format, and it's easily switched up depending on your circumstances. So we are going to take 5 minutes for everyone to review their action and get their worksheet up to par, because you're going to need a general vision of your action to plan the details. So the more specific, the better. We're going to take 5 minutes. Feel free to come off mute if you have any questions that would help you do that. Let's go. all right, everybody have a general vision of their action and as specific as they're comfortable being at the moment. So they feel like they're ready to be perfect. All right, then we are going to dive into logistics and safety. Here is a very unofficial way that I see safety in my mind. Literally, there's like a mind map where I was trying to get this on somehow. I literally think in flowcharts. So the way that I see it is that you've got to plan to figure out what realistic risks are and which ones you want to try to mitigate and which ones you're okay with taking. Then you've got to train people on how to mitigate the risks you're taking, or have people who are experienced, though that comes with a caveat of its own. And then you've got to be able to communicate with them. You've got to communicate with them ahead of time so that you can tell them about the plan, and also in the moment to be able to react to situations as they arise. So while this may seem like a detour, we're going to start with roles, logistics, and general planning. And then I promise we're going to circle back around to safety. Here is a list of a very non-exhaustive list of roles that one can have people do at your strike. You are not going to need them all. It is something that as you grow and you get more people involved, you can give people roles. So the more people feel like they have a role and they're important and they have something to do, the more they're going to engage. So what of all these, is there anyone here that you definitely need for your strike, for the action that you were just planning, thinking back to it? Perfect. I'm glad that this list of roles helps. So yeah, there's going to be some on here that you definitely need. And then there's going to be some on there that are just like nice to have. And then as you go, you're probably going to find roles that aren't on this list. That you can give people. So, because even if your strikes are small, like I said, it's really good to give people roles so that they feel special and needed, and it can significantly reduce the stress on you to have to do everything. So if someone has a talent that doesn't fall into any of these roles, make up a role for them. So for instance, if someone loves to make playlists, right, then make them the music manager so that you can have hype playlists during your actions to keep people pumped. Right? People are so much more likely to stay and be engaged if they feel needed. And if you feel like you're actually they're not just fulfilling a default role and they're not just a cog that can be replaced, but it's really about them bringing in what they're passionate about. Perfect. That's what you've been doing because you didn't know that there were more roles. Absolutely. Like I said, none of this is set in stone. There's no right way to do an action. This is just logical thinking through an experience of things that just kind of need to or can or should get done, depending on your action. So that being said, as you grow and your group grows and you start getting more people and you start getting all these different roles, you're going to need to start coordinating and communicating, which can take a significant amount of time, which is why I'm encouraging you to set up small systems when it's easy, rather than waiting until it's become a problem that you don't have them. Trust me, that's a thing. I strongly encourage you to have some sort of methodology to planning and coordinating your group. In the beginning, this may seem like overkill, but once you do start growing, it'll become super valuable to already have these things in place so you can focus on plugging everybody in instead of trying to figure out how you're going to work together and what works. And that doesn't need to be anything complicated, right? So it can be a group chat and a template Google Doc or a sheet or something that you reuse every time. Or if you already use a task manager like Trello or Asana, right? Those are great. It can be stuff that you're already using. It can be super simple. It's just something to make sure that you're not starting from square one every single time, and you can incorporate learnings as you go. If you don't have ambitions to scale up your local group or your actions, that's perfectly fine. It's still important to have these things in the back of your mind in order to apply them in whatever scale they're applicable to the size of your action. And you can decide whether or not to do something and not just not have done it because you hadn't thought about it. So like I said, it's fully valid to keep your actions simple, especially if you're striking every Friday. You should not be spending much time planning those strikes, right? The point of this methodology is so that you don't waste time and energy on planning. And I'm encouraging you to use those strikes, those Friday strikes or your regular strikes, whenever they are, to come up with that methodology that works for you so that you can scale it when it becomes necessary. For instance, if you're planning a larger global climate strike, so that you're already ready and you know what works for you and your group, because trust me, when that time comes, there will be plenty of other things to focus on, and you're going to be really glad that you have something to fall back on. So here you have a few examples of the tools that I've used. For communication, it's really important to have one that's accessible, but also has the functions you need. So in the beginning, you can use whatever people in your group or potential people are using so that they don't have to download or check an extra app just for this group. So that's probably going to be some sort of messenger app like WhatsApp, Telegram, or even an Instagram chat. I found email and texts to be hard to use and expand, but if that's how you're going to keep people engaged, then go for it. Email and text it is. And each of these has its limitations. So like, for instance, the messenger apps have pretty basic functionalities, and Instagram chats have a limit of 35 members. So it'll kind of depend on what you need and what your group's kind of looking for. And as you grow, you'll need to start splitting into groups and talk about the various roles and tasks. And so you can either create more chats on the platforms that you've already chosen, or you can move something to something like Slack that keeps that all in one place. But you don't want to do something like Slack too early though, because that's going to like disengage people, because they're going to have to, a lot of people don't know Slack. They're going to have to download an extra app, figure all that out, check it, remember to check it and all those things. So I'm not going to go into any more detail on that here, but feel free to stick around or message me if you have specific questions on the communication platform to use. For planning, it's important that these are easy to access and share. So thinking of the available functions is also important, but most of the time you're not going to need anything fancy for your action notes. So accessibility and shareability are the most important aspects in my opinion. I encourage you to choose something where simultaneous editing is possible and where people always have access to the most recent version, and something that's easily accessible on your phone, because a lot of people do a lot on their phone nowadays. So Google Docs is a great tool. People can be in the doc at the same time. Everyone always has the most recent version, and it has a decent amount of functionalities. It's easy to share links and control people's access, and people can look at it on their phone. Compare that, for instance, with a Word document where you have a few more functionalities, but where you need to send the document around to everyone after every edit. And then there's going to be a high likelihood that people are going to start working with different versions. There are workarounds, like there's an online version of Word now, but I found those to be more of a hindrance than a help. But once again, the best one is the one that works for you and your group. So if y'all love Word, then Word it is, right? As your group grows and your actions maybe become a bit more complex, it can be hard to keep an overview in a notes document of any kind. There are great task manager apps out there like Trello and Asana, but those can be a bit more complicated to use and people have to create accounts to access them. So it can also disengage people. I found it easier to just create a bunch of docs and then link them all in one master document, then move to a task manager. So no matter which one you choose though, either of communication or planning, make sure that you keep an overview with links so that people can easily learn what chats and groups exist and how to plug in. And so that you yourself can keep an overview, because it can be a lot. In all of these, whichever you choose, you should be able to, for one, make a template for your action planning, and two, easily coordinate with others, right? You could just plan actions in a chat without creating a doc. But the point is to be able to craft yourself a template for you to easily plug in your variables for each action so that you can make sure that you're not forgetting anything. You don't have to waste time thinking through every aspect again, and you have security in knowing you haven't forgotten anything, and that enables you to collect your learnings. And then also you can coordinate with others. So everyone's always on the same page. They know where to look for the details they need, so you don't have to waste time coordinating where, like, just to get people the information. People can easily plug in and they can see what still needs to be done and also help collect those learnings. So collect learnings is on there twice because it is how we progress and become more efficient. Every action has an external target, right? What we were talking about before, the demands and the targeting, but it's also an opportunity for all organizers. So for instance, to know who filled this role last time. So can we help connect them and see what worked well and what didn't? Is there a material list? So things that we forgot to bring this time, we can add to the material list so we remember them next time and don't have to remember them. Same thing for tasks. So the things that we forgot to do this time that we should do next time. We can create timelines where we're like, okay, this went well, this didn't go so well. We definitely need more time on this, right? So these kinds of learnings are really valuable because especially grassroots activism, like this, what we do now, the people that come fluctuate. So that means that every time, if you've got someone that's done a few actions and they then don't engage, or there's no way for them to pass on what they've learned, then the next person that comes in has to do all that learning again. And there's no way for us to help each other learn and grow and then become more efficient and not waste as much time organizing. So no matter what you choose, it's important to have some sort of overview with links so that new people can easily learn what chats, groups, and docs exist and how to plug in. And that's also going to very likely change as you over time, and it all depends on your current group. So as I said, grassroots organizing is inherently very fluctuating. And while it's important to have structures in place that facilitate easy and efficient coordination, it's super important that these aren't rigid and like in place and then end up becoming more of a burden and a barrier to engagement. And I'm speaking from personal experience here, right? Let's say, for instance, that you love Trello, but no one else in your group is willing to use and update it. In that case, it does not matter how amazing the functionalities are of Trello. People are not going to use it. You're going to spend your time running after people, trying to get them to input their information. No one's going to be on the same page. People are just going to give up, and it's not actually going to help. So the point is, pick communication tools that are easily accessible and planning tools that are easily shareable. So because the better the action is planned, the safer it is. That being said, all actions bring risks, even green actions. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do actions. That's literally like this entire series and what the entire movement's about. But it means that we need to be aware of them to minimize the risks where possible and be prepared for the ones that we know that we're going to be taking. I see there's as two like separate categories of risks. We have organizer risks. So like for the people who are organizing the action, and everyone's risk tolerance is different. So we should never assume, like, for instance, that my green is the same as your green, because risk is also tied to priority, and talking about risks and priority can be really hard. It can get personal. So it's also important to create safe spaces where people feel like they can be honest about what risks they're taking and feedback about the current plan or past actions. And so those are important to be able to get a real picture of how your organizer are actually feeling in that space. If they don't feel like they're able to say, hey, I'm actually not okay with this, right? Then you have no way of judging their risk and what they're actually going to do in the moment should that risk actually occur. And risk can be elevated or come out of unexpected situations if people are tired or stressed. So where possible, encourage self-care, compassion, and love. Those may not seem like safety measures, but the risk that never occurred is always safer than the risk that needs to be mitigated. And then on the other hand, we have the participant risks. So the things that can happen to the people who are attending. Being aware of the type of people that will be attending is super important. For instance, BIPOC have elevated risk levels, the type of police force that are in your area, the amount and the probability that there's going to be some sort of infiltrators or people, hecklers, counter protesters, stuff like that. This very much just scratches the surface of the discussion around like risks and priorities that we could have right now. But the point is just to seed these thoughts now, as this will suffice for smaller actions, because the probability that you're going to have like large counter protesters or like humongous police forces, like a humongous police force come down on your action is pretty small. But just to kind of be aware and start thinking through going to your actions with open eyes, being like, where are the points where this could now, like these different things could happen, and what options do I have to mitigate this? Or if I like can't do anything to prevent it, what can I do should this risk occur? And then we're going to take time to dive deeper into these super important discussions in adequate spaces. For instance, hopefully maybe an advanced series of this where we talk about, or we dive deeper into each individual topic that we've talked about in this series. So thinking back to the roles slide that we had a while ago, here are the roles around safety in the order of necessity by like rising risk. So the basic security role is the marshal. Once you have a few marshals, then you should also have a marshal coordinator. And then if your action gets to the point where you think you're going to be engaging with the police, then you should try to have a police liaison. But that's not until you're planning for like a few hundred people or adding red elements to your actions. So we're not going to dive into that role here. And then same goes for the first aid, awareness, legal observer, and jail support. They're listed here so that you've heard about them, and we can go over them briefly if you want, but we're not going to dive into any details on them in this workshop. The marshal. Their role is to facilitate the action as planned, to act as an information source between planners and demonstrators, to help demonstrators be safe while and feel good about demonstrating, and to act as a buffer between police, hecklers, and bystanders. So for example, they like stand on the outskirts of the crowd at a rally to make sure that the participants don't overflow onto the road or whatever action space that you've designated, because that's going to be your area of control, and you don't want your participants flowing in all kinds of directions or expanding too much so that you don't have control over them anymore. They are going to keep an eye out for people there to make trouble. So those hecklers, in some cases, counter protesters, right? Like those, sometimes there'll be people there that just want to be contrary or that actually disagree with whatever it is you're going to say or the message you're trying to get across. So those are kind of the first instance of between the hecklers and the participants. At marches, for instance, marshals can block traffic or make sure that the march is going along the planned route. So they're like the first ones to go into an intersection and, you know, stop the traffic, make sure all the people then go along the route, aren't going into any like alleys or side places, and then just like bring up the rear and make sure that the whole like the march is staying together. And oftentimes just standing there and looking official is enough to deter any problems. So because your marshal should be clearly visible. So oftentimes what most people do is just have them wear, you know, those vests, those luminescent vests that you have in the back of your car, right? Like that is always a sign of being official. Otherwise you can do like armbands. That's kind of a signal. It's not quite as obvious, but just anything. Sometimes people wear like neon hats, you know, like those neon orange hats or something like that, something that makes it clear that they have some sort of role. They should know the action plan. So as I was saying, if they, you know, if they're on the periphery of a rally or if they're guiding a march, they need to know where that march is going or where the rally is. You laugh, it is like, oftentimes you're gonna like get to the action in the morning, be like, oh shoot, we need more marshals. Here's a vest, you go, just like keep the group together. And the marshal's like, okay, right? That is a thing that happens. And if you have experienced people, you can sometimes get away with that depending on how like complex your action is, but they should know as much of the plan as you can tell them, so that they kind of know, for one, what to do, but also in case the situations arise. And for instance, they don't have time to talk to the marshal coordinator, or they can't find that person isn't answering their phone. They can make their best informed decision and not have to then, they don't make a decision. And then you're like, but this thing, and they're like, but I didn't know, you know, that was the plan that we were going to do. So as I said there, they need to have some sort of way of communicating with each other and with a clear person that's in charge so that they can, when snap decisions need to be made, especially ones that influence the whole group and aren't just an individual marshal's decision. There should be some sort of marshal coordinator who then very clearly is the person in that situation to make the decision. We are non-hierarchical, but actions need to have clear decision-making structures because oftentimes it's going to need to be a fast reaction. And then there shouldn't be any questions. It's like during the action is not the time to discuss. If a marshal is of a different opinion of how the situation should be handled than the marshal coordinator, that marshal waits until after the action to talk to the marshal coordinator about it. Then we can sit down, have full group discussions about what was right and what was wrong, how to handle a situation like that in the future. But it is super important that during the action itself is not the time that the marshals start like discussing how to handle the situation in like between themselves. There needs to be one person that can make a fast decision. Marshals should avoid carrying signs or banners. Like I said, that goes along with being distinguishable from the participants, but also that they're not like holding, like they're not like one of the people holding the banner and then there's a situation, or just like that it just like distracts from the job of kind of watching out. Oftentimes marshals don't actually need to do or engage in anything, but they do need to be aware of what's going on. So just kind of making sure that they have one role and one role only. And it can often feel like, as a marshal, I can do all these other things. Like I can do these things and still keep an eye on the crowd. I very strongly encourage you, as just like with any roles, it's one role per person. Oftentimes with small actions, we tend to just be like, oh, I can be the marshal coordinator and the police liaison. And I can also just like, oh, I can be the art marshal too, because I'm already going to be marshaling and walking through the crowd. And the more roles people take, there's almost always something that happens then where it gets distracted. The person gets distracted from the one role and then something slips through the cracks. Elizabeth. Yeah, I think some roles are compatible. So for instance, if they're in the same category, right? So if we think back to that role sheet where, like, for instance, the photographer and the social media person are the same thing or something like that. And then also like the amount of, if the photographer, like if the social media person, for instance, the photographer and the social media person are the same person and they like get distracted from the social media thing, like that's fine, right? There's no humongous consequences. You'll just, potentially have missed something on social media, but that's fine. It's something different when it's things like logistics, coordination, safety, things like that, where people are really going to have to focus. So for instance, like program managers, once you start getting speakers and stuff like that, that person really should be focused on making sure that, the speakers know that they're next, everything like the program's running, those kinds of things, and can't really be doing many, like some other things. So rule of thumb is one role, but that will also depend on the size of your group and whether that's possible and how complex your action is. So if your friend's comfortable taking on a medium and a small size role, then that is good. And also just like, these are also times to test ourselves and experiment and experience and like learn and gather experience. So if at this action, she takes on 2 roles and she's like, actually, I thought I could do them both, but I didn't. The next time you're going to take one, or it goes super well and she learns to like do both of those roles, either not simultaneously, but then, as you scale and she can take over the one role that then grows into a larger one and help someone else grow into that other role, right? So these strikes are always also a time for us to just like learn and grow and gain experience. So there's also, in most cases, like I said, outside of maybe something with security going wrong, in most cases, if something goes wrong, it's not the end of the world. By next week, people are going to have already forgotten. The most important thing is just that you take that learning from it. All right. Next, marshals should always stay calm. It is super important. Oftentimes, it can be little things that lead, like depending on the size of the crowd, that kind of lead to some sort of panic. It can be something completely innocuous, right? Kind of how that crowd panic occurs can be very random. And so the most important thing is that no matter what happens, the marshals always stay calm, because they are going to be the people, they're going to be the ones that participants look to, not like for guidance and for safety. So that means just like having a calm demeanor, almost never running, because running, even if it's just like to get to the next cross section, that people oftentimes don't know why you're running. It's very hard to run in a non-stressed manner. And especially if people don't know what's going on, that's what's going to get them kind of nervous. So yeah, always having a very calm and in control demeanor, even if they don't actually know what's going on, that is fine. They do not do the police's job. Ever. They are not the police. They are not like your little security guard. They literally just like are the first line of defense, that kind of are the people who feel responsible for keeping an eye out on things. Their safety is also still priority. So they should, if there is a fight going on or they see that one's about to come and they don't feel like, they do not need to jump in there. That's not their role. They need to make sure that other participants stay out of it. If they can and they feel confident, they can go in and try to de-escalate the situation. But their priority then is to just pull the other participants away, make sure it doesn't spread into like panic. If it needs to, then they call the police or, 911, the ambulance, whatever is necessary in that situation. that they do not ever need to put themselves in danger. They are not the police and should never also try to do the police's job. They should also never get between the police. If there are police there, then the police do their thing. If there's a police liaison, then they can they can make sure that the police liaison knows what's going on and call the police liaison in, right? Make sure all the organizers know what's going on, that kind of a thing. But they should never try to do the police's job, interfere with the police, or touch a police officer. That is an offense. And then just because of all that, you never know what's going to happen. Encourage people to wear sturdy shoes and clothes. I have seen people come want to be a marshal in like flip-flops and mini shorts. It's doable, but if something needs to be picked up, lifted, moved, stuff's going on, that can be a hindrance and one that's easily avoidable. Right. That is all to marshals. Then permits. So you can check your local regulations. You may need a permit depending on the number of people or the location. So like if you're on public, government, or private property, and the activity. So like your type of action that you're doing, the equipment that you're using, the space that's required for it, and those kinds of things. So for instance, in DC, demonstrating on public sidewalks is legally permissible without a permit, so long as we don't block the walkway and there's fewer than 100 people that are expected. And even on national parks property, only protests of 25 people or more require a permit. Let's see, we are allowed to march on the street as long as we stay within a single lane without a permit. But any event that requires like the street to be closed, or if we're wanting to use Capitol property, we technically need a permit. And we need a permit if we're wanting to set up anything like a stage or speakers or a tent. So there's a lot of like smaller details, but that's like a broad overview to kind of know the rough, the like outline of where and when permits are, so that even if you don't think you need a permit or just aren't going to permit, even if you know that you technically need one, it's smart to know when you're squarely in your right, when you're kind of like pushing the boundaries into the gray zone, and then when you're actually doing something that's unpermitted. And doing something unpermitted doesn't mean you can't or shouldn't do it, but you need to be aware of the risks. So that being said, even applying for a permit can have its downsides. For instance, on the one hand, your action's not going to get shut down by the police if you have a permit, and attendees probably won't get arrested. On the other hand, applying for a permit can take up quite a bit of time and energy, especially in the beginning and depending on the size and complexity of your action. So you need to weigh whether it's a worthwhile use of your time. For FFF actions, attendees will probably feel safer doing something that's allowed and are more likely to come then. But be aware that a large police presence, sometimes with like bikes and dogs, is potentially scarier than not having a permit, where the police would potentially like just tell you to go home. Because in most cases, police will give you a warning before disbanding you, and like especially before making any arrests. So you'll have time to decide whether you want to push it or whether you just want to follow the police's instructions. At FFF, we strive to provide accessible actions for youth to protest. That can also, though, feed into the current police systems and establishment. And one of our aims is to rethink our current systems and structures. So it will depend on whether the impact that you're having on the people you're turning out outsizes the reinforcement of the police. For most FFF actions that pass the boundaries into technically needing a permit, we do permit them. There are plenty of organizations that don't permit, so we strive to create space for people who don't feel comfortable going to those types of actions. However, safe spaces look different depending on where you are. So the decision on whether to permit and how to deal with the police is one that can only be made locally. Like, for instance, in DC, police are very used to protesters, and there's a very large activism community. So even though BIPOC are still more likely to experience police brutality, that threshold of the police stepping in is much higher. And when they do, the BIPOC are surrounded by white allies who know to step in should that actually occur. But I was just at an action in Alabama, for instance, where that was just entirely not the case. So there, BIPOC are much more at risk from the police, and also the community is structured differently. So how a permitted or unpermitted action will lead to encounters with the police is very different. So all these decisions are going to rely on a little bit of looking things up, being aware, having a ground knowledge of your risks and your targets, people that are either your organizers or your participants, and just kind of what the regulations are and what the police are like in your area. All right. That being said, it is now your turn to figure all that out. We're going to give y'all 10 minutes to do some research, get started on those things that we've been talking about. So like how many people are allowed, how many people are allowed to gather without a permit? Are there areas where a permit is required? Like I said, like in DC, it's on Capitol grounds. Who can I contact? So a lot of times the police departments have special events departments who then handle these kinds of marches, rallies. There's also a lot of times different types of events. So for instance, in DC, our actions are always called First Amendment actions or events, right? And then the question is, where do I apply for them? In DC, we have like so many different types of police departments. And so depending on where an action is, depends on where we need to apply for it. In smaller towns, that may be just like, there might just be one police department and that's where you go. And you're just like, hey, I want to protest. And they're like, all right, go for it. Right. So kind of who do I contact? Where do I even find these things out? Oftentimes in smaller towns, there's not going to be like set places where you can Google this. You may just need to call your police department, and just don't be afraid of asking your way through till you reach the right person, and then write down their contact information. And then needing to know what information is required to apply for a permit. So oftentimes they're going to want to know, like, when are you starting? How long, like, or do you need setup? What are you bringing? What are you doing? Is there an action page? Those kinds of things are going to depend fully on the police department or whatever kind of department it is that you need to get a permit from. And then once you know those things, it's time to incorporate them into your planning. So if you do need a permit, like I said, what information am I going to need to provide, which means that you need to make sure that that's all been planned, or at least is being planned. Oftentimes, if you like have direct contact to that person at the police department or whatever permitting department, then you can kind of just hop on the phone and be like, hey, we're still working on this thing. They're also just people. Oftentimes they're like, that's fine. And then the next question then being, do I need marshals? And then if so, what materials do I need? So oftentimes the police are going to want to know, what are your marshals going to be wearing? How are we going to be able to tell who's a marshal? Are you going to have a marshal coordinator or a police liaison? Things like that. And then this is not at all directly tied to safety, but just as you're going in and you're thinking through roles and things, I wanted to plug one specific role, and that's the cleanup crew, because that one is almost always forgotten. And so like 90% of the actions I've been to, the action is over, the core organizers are left, the area is just like, there's posters and water bottles and all these things strewn around. And it's the core organizers who have already been doing all the work of getting everything organized, who are left to then also do the cleanup. Or they're like so pumped and they just like leave, right? There's another action, or they're just like part of the crowd and just kind of goes. And we really want to make sure that we leave spaces cleaner than we found them. So incorporating cleanup into your action planning is a way to make sure that it's not always the same people who are left doing the cleanup. Alrighty, it is it's a little bit later than I thought. We'll do like 7 minutes and then come back and we can answer any questions and do a quick wrap up. Okay, yeah, that was definitely not enough time to finish the research. And yes, maybe hard to get answers to the questions. The search engine isn't the greatest, but also depending on how big your town is, as I was saying, it may be that the police or whatever department that you need to apply for permits for, it just doesn't have those like set guidelines. Like I said, in DC, people are like super used to demonstrators and actions everywhere. So everyone's got like the rules written out. Yeah, it very well may be that you just need to start with calling your police department and being like, hey, I want to do this thing, not trying to cause any problem, just trying to raise awareness for this thing. What's the permitting process look like? And they may say, I don't know. They're like, well, can you direct me to somebody? Right. And just kind of, you may just have to ask your way through that. And none of this is meant to like instill any kind of fear or anything like that. First of all, most of the time, police are going to give you warnings. Like if they do actually appear to your action, if it's like, for instance, unpermitted or things are escalating and they do come, police are always going to give you warnings. They're not just going to like appear and just be like, start making arrests and disbanding you. So you're always going to have opportunities to comply with the police. And then if you do have a permit and more people come than expected, that's also usually fine. It's like, it would have to be a significantly like more amount of people that need to come to an event before the police are like, this is more than what you put in your permit. So I know that like in Berlin, we had like hundreds of thousands of people more there. And the police were like, well, and especially at some point, right, there's police, like there's only so much that the police can do. So they're just there to do like, to control the crowd more than like try to disband it or whatever it is. And so all of this is, like I said, not to instill any kind of fear into like doing something wrong or, from the police. It's just more about you being able to feel secure in your action, knowing when you're in your rights. Like if somebody does come up, and it can oftentimes not even be the police, just like other organizers, participants, you can be very, very secure in knowing and saying that you know what you're doing and what risks you're taking and you're putting the participants in. And it's also a good place for elders and parents to come and help, right? It's like marshals, all kinds of security roles. Those are great places for people who want to plug in to come and help, people who are maybe in college around you or whatever it is. So the elders and the parents can definitely help there. And then, so as you see, there's literally a role for everybody. If you have any questions about any of these things or about any of the roles as you go, you can always contact either FFF or you can always contact me directly. For those who are on the FFUS Slack, you can always just DM me. And all of these things are also often easier to do as a local group, right? That's how you're going to keep these learnings in your group. That's how you're going to benefit from them and also get people to stick with their roles, be able to kind of feed into this broader network of being able to say that you're part of this larger thing, learn from other groups and their learnings and all those things, and learn about other actions that are happening and where you can plug in. So I do highly encourage you, if you have not yet, to also set up a local group within the Fridays for Future US network. We are there to help you figure all these things out. Alrighty, there are plenty of things that I did not cover in this workshop, so please stick around to ask any questions or also drop comments in the chat or in the YouTube description about what you really liked, what you would have liked to have seen in these, more things that you want to learn about, and then hopefully we'll be able to do a deeper dive workshop into these different things. Like I said, you can always also directly contact us and you can watch all of the workshops with all of the various links and the materials that we mentioned in them all in the YouTube description. All available on our website with all the links. So thank you very much. Feel free to stick around and ask any questions, but that was it. Thank you much, Lee.